Good evening, welcome to this Resolution Foundation event on how should the government set its new industrial strategy. And we're going to hear in a moment from Richard Parker, who is very relevant to this as Mayor of the West Midlands, and also from Esther Bowler, who is at Imperial College Business School as an assistant professor, and Jordan Cummings, Director of UK Competitiveness at the CBI. So we've got a fantastic panel. This being the Resolution Foundation, we're going to start with some slides, but I have displayed enormous self-control. There are only 4 slides. Richard asked why there weren't 42, which is the right question to ask. I'm sorry for anybody who is hoping for 42. But let me just give you 4 slides which kind of summarise the key points from our Economy 2030 inquiry and bring out its relevance to this discussion of industrial strategy. First of all, the evidence is overwhelming that Britain's comparative advantage is in services. That's where we have a lead. We are the second largest exporter of services of any country in the world, second only to the US. And that's why one of the messages in our Economy 2030 inquiry was that we had to focus on services, and why it was a particular challenge for me to go to Birmingham with one of our researchers at Resolution. I was instructed by Torsten, go to Birmingham and explain that it's services that really matters for the future. And we got through the evening, but it is sometimes challenging, but that's the core message, with some qualifications. Secondly, when we do, sticking with the theme of Birmingham, as we have the Mayor of the West Midlands with us, one of the key themes in our report was that Britain's twin second cities, Birmingham and Manchester, do face a massive challenge, but are so important for the performance of the UK economy that they are priorities for investment and attention. And when you look at the challenge facing them, why their productivity is so much lower than London, one of the main arguments and main explanations is that they don't enjoy the kind of agglomeration effects that you get from large numbers of people being able to come into the centre and work effectively. And this slide tells you that, although it gives you the absolute figures, I can tell you the percentages. Approximately 25% of graduates living in the wider Birmingham area, and that is only 145,000. That is, and 25% is only 145,000. Those are the only people, those are the graduates who can get to the centre of Birmingham in half an hour. So this is telling you that your central business district has only got 145,000 graduates who can get there in half an hour, about a quarter of them, and just over 300,000 non-graduates, also actually about a quarter of them. So the radial routes in to assure you of a large functioning agglomeration efficient central business district just don't exist in Birmingham and Manchester, and we argue those are a priority for investment, tackling that weakness. Thirdly, the classic challenge as well, that we're very good at having the new ideas. This is total number of Nobel Prizes won over the life of the Nobel Prizes relative to the population per million people in the population. And Britain does have an extraordinary record there. And by the way, this is not just history. This is not just grizzled old Victorians with beards winning Nobel Prizes. We are still winning them in today's topics, 2 this year in disciplines relevant for AI. But when it comes to applying them, our growth performance now lagging so far behind the US. So an exceptionally good ideas generation machine, quite possibly the world's best and most efficient, not showing up in performance in GDP per head. So the challenge of successfully innovating is another key to future growth. And then we have as well just a reminder of what has happened to our performance. This shows actually going back, if you try to find a pattern, going back to both to the premierships of Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, you could argue there was a sustained effort to raise our productivity and growth performance, and there was indeed some catch-up in GDP per head on purchasing power parities. We were catching up with the US, but there was a turning point and you could argue that it was around the financial crash. You could argue actually some of the warning signals were coming a bit earlier. But since the financial crash, we've had a very poor performance, both in absolute terms and relative to some of the competition, like the US. Now, you can interpret this as a pessimistic warning about poor performance. You could also interpret it in a more optimistic way. This shows that there is scope for a catch-up strategy, and we have indeed delivered a successful catch-up strategy in the recent past. So we approach the discussion about industrial strategy in the spirit that these things can be done. I myself have wrestled with the challenge of industrial strategy alongside Vince Cable and then advising my friend Greg Clark. And I went through the thought process that so many people in government have gone through. You may start thinking that the best policies are all horizontal and just trying to raise the performance of the economy as a whole. But you then find that the actual decisions you are taking as a minister and the levers at your disposal in government are often vertical decisions. Where do you put new transport investment? Is this specific firm or sector worth rescuing or not? So let's now open up to discussion, and our first intervention is from Richard Parker, Mayor of the West Midlands. Richard, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here, and I've not come back for revenge, David, to talk about the important issues facing our economy and why advanced manufacturing is still relevant to us, and it is. But it's great to be here this evening sharing with you some of the work we're doing in the West Midlands to drive growth and particularly to improve our economic performance that has frankly is woeful as that of the countries, certainly over the last 10 or 15 years. I will set out some of the work we're doing, but also why 3 of my 4 big priorities are key to unlocking that growth we talked about. I've set a platform which is focused on 3 big areas which will dominate my agenda for the next 4 years. Growth, and that means growth for everyone, growth that everyone in the West Midlands needs to benefit from. Jobs for everyone, we've got profound issues around skills and productivity, and I'll talk about that. The fact that journeys for everyone, David's already talked about the transport connectivity issues in the West Midlands. They are deep and profound and holding back our performance. And also homes for everyone, we've got acute shortage of affordable social housing, and that's driving a lot of my housing priorities. But I'm going to focus on growth, on journeys, which is in essence transport, and on jobs and skills this evening. In terms of the challenge we face on jobs in the West Midlands, I don't have any slide, but we have some profound issues in the West Midlands. We've got around the quarter of the workforce with low skills or no skills. That means that too many people in work, if they are in work, are very low-paid jobs and will forever be in low-paid jobs given the level of skills that they don't have. And we've got twice as many young people out of work than the national average. And too many of those young people come from the poorest parts of our region. Unless we can improve the productivity and the economic performance and upskill the workforce, we're going to have some profound issues in our region. And that's why one of my first policy responses was to introduce a West Midlands Youth Plan, and that's been supported by the government, and Liz Kendall's been up a couple of times to see the work that we're doing. So we're not just going to help young people get access to those skills, but give them access to jobs and work opportunities what will change their lives. So I've created a programme, a West Midlands Youth Plan, and we're aiming to create 20,000 new work placements opportunities, training opportunities and apprenticeships for young people. And we've already made some real good progress with that cohort around something called a Path to Apprenticeship programme. And that's so important because at the moment, I not just need the West Midlands to be more productive and more competitive, I cannot afford to have an economy that leaves so many people and so many young people behind. And we know that skills are the biggest barrier to growth and opening up opportunities for those people. And when we speak to businesses, the biggest barrier to those businesses investing in the West Midlands is access to the skills that they need. And I'll say a bit more about high-end skills a bit later, but we are short of 800 welders in the West Midlands and there is an excess demand in some parts of the region, 4 or 5 times the demand to construction type apprenticeships than the courses we can provide. And in some parts of our region, access to those opportunities will change people's lives and actually help grow our economy. And that's why myself as a mayor and other mayors, metro mayors, are all talking to the DFE and really demanding a greater say in post-16 skills education, because in most of our urban landscapes, the challenges we face around low skills, low aspiration, and actually an absence of hope in our young people is a really, really challenging issue. And working closely with businesses and our training providers, I think we can resurrect a skills system that will ensure that every young person gets access to opportunities that can make the difference. And we know that, and I know that that's not just fabric delivering growth and prosperity in large parts of the post-industrial bits of the West Midlands, particularly the Black Country, but it's key to improving people's well-being and their mental health too. And those demands are putting increasing stress on large amounts of our public sector. So I'm in no doubt that we have to develop an industrial strategy that recognises the skills issue and that place matters, and we and I, like all the other mayors, would like a greater opportunity to shape a skills system so it fits with the needs of our employees in the region. The growth agenda, and David has quite rightly talked about the poor levels of economic performance and productivity we have in this region, in the country. In the West Midlands, our issues and challenges are quite profound. We trail national economic performance or productivity by around 30%. So again, not untypical for a region that is largely post-industrial still and not recovered since the time the steel mills and heavy industries closed, again particularly in our inner city areas in the Black Country. But also, we, believe it or not, the last 8 years, our economic performance vis-a-vis Manchester has declined by almost 20%, which means that on average, using GVA as a measure, the average person in Manchester earns 20% more than the average person in the West Midlands, and as an investment proposition, Manchester is 20% more attractive. And we're starting to turn the pages on that and understand what some of the issues we face and the barriers to those challenges are. But there is hope, and a lot of hope. We have some fantastic universities in the West Midlands and businesses at the forefront of delivering new technology. And we've got 3 investment zones. So one of the first things I did when I got elected was get the approval from the council leaders that sit on my board to support 3 investment zones. There's one in Coventry in the southeast of the region, which is going to focus on battery technology for advanced manufacturing, one in the city centre in Birmingham around life sciences, and one in Wolverhampton, the Green Innovation Corridor. And those three investment zones are aiming to attract £5 billion worth of investment and create 30,000 jobs. Those jobs will be in high-performing, highly productive sectors, and of course my responsibility is to ensure that those jobs go to people learning, living and developing skills in the region. And that is absolutely fabric, those projects are obviously fabric to developing a new economy which will lift our productivity and our competitiveness. I've got this dual challenge of having to grow our economy around those new jobs in those new sectors that will drive growth, but not leaving those cohorts of young people behind from our poorest communities that often leave school with little or no qualifications. So we're developing a growth plan, and there's no surprises in the sectors that are going to drive our growth. David quite rightly has referred to professional services, which is at the heart of it, supported by life sciences, green technology and creative and digital. And probably the only time I'll contradict the Resolution Foundation in my life, and I learned this evening, is the focus on advanced manufacturing. It is the bedrock and still the heart of our regional economy, and it is where we have enormous competitive advantage. And if we lost that, frankly, the West Midlands economy would be in ruin really quite quickly. But I've told the civil servants that I need a growth plan that is embedded in and resonates and has relevance with the whole region. So whilst it's going to focus on those new industries of the future, it will recognise the importance of construction, engineering and logistics, because for those young people I've mentioned, if I'm going to have a growth plan that's relevant to the region, it needs to reflect the life chances and opportunities that I need to deliver, particularly for those young kids from the poorest backgrounds. But more importantly, and it's something that came up on the paper that the Resolution Foundation produced in advance of this evening, is that what's more important to me than the sectors we're focusing on, or indeed the foundation industry that I want to underpin it, is the route map. What are those actions and interventions we need to make that are going to move our economy from where it is today to where it needs to be in 10 years' time? And that is where truly the real focus of work needs to be. And hopefully we'll do some more work with the folks here to look at what we need to do to make the change and deliver the changes that will truly change people's lives in the West Midlands and make our regional economy the best place to invest in the UK, is which something that I'm very keen to deliver. On buses and on transport, it's not very sexy, but 80% of people that use public transport in the West Midlands use the buses, and the bus network is failing people. It's not allowing that connectivity that David has referred to. And we love metros, but they're too expensive, frankly. The topography in the West Midlands isn't great, but they cost about £100 million a mile. And there's a lot of miles to cover if we're going to connect people by metro. And in the past, we've only been delivering half a mile a year. And in the 28 years since we've had a metro, only delivered 14 miles of track. Most human beings walking 2 miles a day could have walked from the North Pole to the South Pole and halfway back in that time. So we need to deliver that infrastructure quicker if it's going to make a difference to people's lives. And that's why I am doing exactly what Andy Burnham has done, of delivering a plan for franchising the buses, so we can ensure that we are aligning routes, a bus network in the West Midlands, with the routes that will help people. And I'll reflect on a conversation I had at Solihull Chamber of Commerce at the back end of my campaign, when I asked them how I could help, what advice they had for me. And they said, and it did surprise me, they talked about the bus network. Solihull is the most prosperous part of the West Midlands, most of it's more like the southeast and the northeast. But in the north of the borough are 3 very deprived communities of Smithswood, Chelmsley Wood and Kingshurst. And the young kids there can't get to the jobs in Solihull Town Centre or at the airport or JLR, Jaguar Land Rover, because the bus timetable isn't aligned to shift patterns. And there are hundreds of young people in that part of the region that can't get to work because the transport system doesn't work for them. And we're hoping that a franchising system where all of us local political leaders have a say in how we design the network will make a difference to the lives of those people. So we're focusing on an industrial strategy that is full of ambition about those industries of the future, but I cannot afford to leave large cohorts of our community, in particular our young people, behind, because frankly, if we do, the scenes we saw on our streets over the summer won't be once in a decade event. They'll be happening every year. So I'm really keen we're working with our teams now to building out the growth plan. The industrial strategy, quite rightly, needs to be a partnership between business, between government, between mayors and our universities. And that shared vision is something that is very compelling and is proving very attractive to the businesses that we're working for. And if we can do that, as I said before, we can make a big difference and deliver that ambition. But at this point in time, frankly, the bits that are going to be really matter, and I think it's covered in the Resolution Foundation's report, is about those actions and interventions that are going to help us implement an industrial strategy that will deliver the growth that we need if we're going to be far more competitive as a country, and particularly compared to the US. Thank you very much.
Great. Very good. Thank you, Richard, and thanks for that very clear agenda. I should have said at the beginning, of course, this, for our online participants in particular, if you go to the Resolution Foundation's website and go to the Slido page, do start putting in your questions. We've got some arriving already. Now we're going to Esther Bowler, who is Associate Professor at Imperial College Business School, but is also a Research Associate at the Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE, with whom we worked in partnership as we produced our Economy 2030 report. And you work, Esther, particularly on the effects of innovation and globalisation on firm performance. We look forward to your comments.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. And I read both the strategy and this briefing note with great interest. And I think it comes across quite clearly that this is a strategy that's been written very much with sort of academic spirit in mind, because it touches upon basically all of the things that I would have said if someone asked me to write this sort of strategy. I do think that the briefing note highlights a lot of the things that also went through my mind when I read it, which is that the strategy has a lot of very well-founded, clear ideas, and it's much less specific on how exactly we're going to reach them. And in particular, there are several points where I feel like it's very easy to get into a situation where these goals are in direct opposition to each other. And I think Richard here highlighted some of them already, which is the tension between achieving high growth and particularly targeting sectors where we know that we're competitive, such as services, but also not leaving vast parts of the country sort of falling behind. And in particular, when it comes to this tension between services and manufacturing, I think there's a very strong regional component there, where we have to make some really tough choices if we are going to make actual policy out of this. And I think I'm going to say some things that might annoy Richard and some things that probably will not. And I think sort of bottom line, my view is that there are so many things that we can do in this country that will help without running into any of these tensions. And infrastructure in particular, I think, is a key one, which of course is touched upon a lot in the industrial strategy and also in the Resolution Foundation discussion paper. And in terms of green infrastructure in particular, you're talking about bus routes, making people able to get to where the productive jobs are. I think is such a low-hanging piece of fruit that really this government can make great progress on picking. And I think now we get to the point which may annoy you a little bit, which is that I think sometimes we have a tendency to get a little hung up on the importance of having very good manufacturing jobs. That's not to say that there's not overlap sometimes, and particularly for some sectors there might be, these policies might actually go hand in hand. But I feel like that's probably not where the majority of good jobs are going to be in the future. I think good manufacturing jobs are hard to come by, basically across the globe, but particularly in rich economies. And that the government can do a lot here by focusing on creating good services jobs. Where there's some overlap, I think might be, for instance, when we talk about green technology. I think there is scope for having development of green technology in manufacturing firms where there's also a lot of spillovers to services. So I don't think it's a blanket statement, but overall, my vote, we had some discussion questions on whether we should target growth versus, whether we should target manufacturing versus services, and my vote would go to the services above manufacturing. Then, of course, I think we also are in a position where we can open up a lot of the regional versus sort of strong growth focus on the cities in this space that has to do with the green economy. Because here I feel like we have lots of scope for developing green technology projects and infrastructure projects where we actually leverage the capabilities that are spread around the country, and we can actually create growth, regional growth, by focusing on these kinds of policies, which we would not get from a pure city focus. So I think those are my probably main points, but I definitely agree with you that I think in terms of whether we need to set clear overall growth targets above regional equity measures, I don't think that's a clear-cut choice. I think we've seen many examples from other countries as well, that even if we have strong growth metrics and actually all the arrows are pointing in the right direction on the aggregate level, people don't necessarily experience that if they feel very left behind and if they see that their day-to-day lives are not changing. And that's, I think, a point where we really need to keep an eye on making this growth more inclusive. Then there was also a question around whether and what kind of policies will help versus hinder firms in growing. And here I've done some work myself that speaks to this. So I know this is not going to be a debate around trade policy, but I would argue very strongly that trade policy helps firms grow if we do it in the right way. And I think having very close ties with our trading partners, and mostly I would say there's a lot of research in trade that says that we are going to trade a lot more with countries that are nearby and very little with countries that are very far away. So, not getting too specific, I think breaking off trading relationships with our closest countries it's probably not the way to go. So aligning ourselves as much as we can in terms of regulation and other non-tariff barriers as well with the EU, I think would help a lot to help firms grow. And also there's this issue around financial constraints and access to finance, which I think is particularly salient if we think about firms that do green technology development. We know from much literature that it might be harder for firms that don't have access to finance to be able to grow. And if they don't have any tangible capital that they can come and post as collateral, they might struggle to get access to bank financing. So helping firms being able to finance their future projects, I think will bring lots of benefits. So in overall terms, I think having a predictable strategy is going to be very beneficial. There's a lot of discussion in the industrial strategy around making sure that firms know what's coming in the next 5 to 10 years, which I think is very admirable. We know from a lot of research that is going to help firms grow. There's of course a question as to how the current government can make sure that the policies that they put in place will still be there in future years. But I think it's a very admirable goal to have.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Esther. And now Jordan Cummings, Director of UK Competitiveness at CBI. Over to you, Jordan.
Well, thanks for having us. I always love coming down here because it kind of feels like you're at a showing for a theatre premiere, which is quite nice.
That's the right vibe.
Enviable leather chairs that we don't have over at CBI Towers. So, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. The CBI's view is we've worked on a few of these. I've worked on a few of these in my time at the CBI. I'll say 3 things. So firstly, why it's important that we have it and the moment we shouldn't squander. A little bit about Whitehall and the challenges that are coming, I think, with getting this going. And then a little bit about what everyone in this room and everyone online can do to help, I think, government and business, because this isn't going to be easy. So on the why it's important, I think we've done a good spread of we're not growing enough, we haven't consistently been politically stable enough, we haven't mapped out the economy we want to be, all of the things that we all know because we've read things over the years from the Resolution Foundation, the CBI and others. But I don't think we've understood that this is really serious in some parts of the economy. So every 6 months you will get an FT article or a front page about steel or another sector that is going under, that needs big state capital support. And it bubbles up for a couple of days and then it disappears. And then in 6 months later, you'll get another one, bubbles up for a couple of days, then broadly disappears. Now, most people that would go unnoticed for them, but those things are really important because they are usually symptomatic of a country that hasn't quite spelled out what economy it wants to have in 5, 10, 15 years' time, which is impossible to do, right? If you've got 5 years in office and you're not sure if you're going to get 10. So I think importantly, we haven't had that plan for quite some time. We've never been honest with ourselves as a post-industrialist society that the advanced manufacturing debate that we've just had is very difficult for a country that once made loads of stuff that the world used, that now makes very little things that the world uses. And there are some races that we just won't win. I got in trouble recently for saying we're not going to out-manufacture the Chinese EV machine because we quite simply won't do that. We can't be competing on volume terms, but we can compete in value terms. So the vision for the future economy is really important. The fact that this government has majored on an industrial strategy and not called it something else, despite all the baggage that we all have from doing this multiple times in the past, we should give them credit for doing so because they didn't have to do that. And I think the joy of it is that you can land loads of things behind it and so everyone gets a kind of common front door into government. The downside of that is then the bit I'll come to, which is next, on the kind of Whitehall ways of working. So let's not squander the opportunity that they've chosen to go for something that has brand resonance. And then the last point is just on not to moan about the budget. So that's what that's not what I'm here for. But there will be things that government has to do because an industrial strategy isn't the extent of your tax and spend that will make it harder for some parts of the economy to grow. They can't not do them. That doesn't mean that business won't be angry about the fact that they've had to be done. And so it's really important that we don't go into this assuming that this industrial strategy is just going to solve everything and is going to make every way of growing for the private sector easier, because that's not possible. And just to say, the OBR figures on growth, 1.5% at the end of the parliamentary term, that's better than where we are now, but business investment actually goes down. So that's not where we want to be on business investment. Second point on Whitehall ways of working. This is a real opportunity. Missions are new for the government. And so getting that done is actually probably a knotty, IFG focused thing, which lots of people won't really understand, but it is actually quite important for the manner in which you can govern through a big front door like the industrial strategy. So we've got a moment to make these mission boards work, and a real opportunity for the people in this room and online to give the right evidence at the right time, to guide some of that mission structure. It'll be disruptive for the civil service, it'll be challenging for some parts of Whitehall, but it's probably really important for the type of step change that this type of strategy is trying to achieve. And then my last point on what it should then effectively do, and I'm sure we'll get into this in the discussion a bit more, it's government's job to go after the things that will grow the fastest. So of course you choose 8 sectors that will give you 10, 15% growth over the parliamentary term. You'd be mad not to. But in doing so, you will semi-ignore the kind of 1 to 3% growing companies that employ 200 people and have done for the last 30 years in some of those foundational sectors that won't necessarily get you big bang trade deal type growth numbers. And so it's really good that the government has recognised that to underpin those 8 sectors, there are loads of foundational sectors. It's just really important that they don't detach the effort in the civil service on those 2 things, because the things that those foundational sectors often need to grow are the things that we've all been talking about for years: reform the planning system, build more infrastructure, get the skills planning going. And so I think it's really important that we go after them, we chase down those kind of big growth prizes, but don't forget about the rest of the economy, because the rest of the economy is usually the people you see on the high street. And if people can't feel an industrial strategy, it's very difficult for you then to get voted in again. So long story short, I think there's an honesty piece about the races that we can win as a nation, and we shouldn't squander the fact that this government has been open about doing something that has brand resonance. There's a piece around Whitehall reform, the mission-based structures, which is really important. Let's not forget about it and just say it's a processy thing over here. And then we should be really kind of open about the long-term plan and how feasible we can kind of build in some of the milestones. Because I think the Prime Minister's speech last week is a first attempt to say we're going to make this more human for people, and part of making it more human is not saying everything is in life sciences in Cambridge, not everything is in high growth sectors. People in the economy have a voice too.
Thank you very much. And I think you were right, Jordan, that the brand of industrial strategy has always suffered from the belief that it's picking winners, which failed in the 1970s. I have to say, the British Leyland experience and Red Robber, you wouldn't believe the number of conversations where people think that is what industrial strategy is, when of course actually the car industry in the 80s and 90s is a very good example of smart industrial strategy, attracting Japanese investment and Indian investment, and a successful rebuilding of that manufacturing industry. I think we should begin just on and we'll start with you, Richard, to give you an opportunity. This whole, are we the services superpower versus advanced manufacturing? And there's a couple of questions that tie into that, which is one is how can we be confident the sectors that have driven growth in the past few decades will drive the growth in the future? So what should we be thinking about? And there's also a question about manufacturing jobs. Should they be expected to move both into different types of jobs and move around the country? And especially in Birmingham, and you commented on this in your opening remarks, with the enormous historic significance of manufacturing. Why, when we see that even post-Brexit, despite our belief that the Brexit deal was best for manufacturing or goods, it's ended up, services have carried on growing and manufacturing have had a bad time. Just remind us of why you think that we can't just settle for the services agenda.
Well, no, thank you, David. And look, it's pretty obvious. We can't build an economy for a country of our size with a population of around services alone. That is, frankly, pretty obvious to all of us, I think. I'm not denying where we might see most growth, but I cannot afford to lead a region, and other mayors in other urban regions that have suffered terribly since we deindustrialised cannot afford to leave parts of their economy that represent 20% of the workforce behind by telling them you're not relevant anymore, when they are working in very difficult circumstances in businesses that are actually profitable today. So what we need to do is enhance and build on those skills, to create some competitive advantage. And that's why the investment zone we've got in Coventry in the southeast of the region, called Green Power Park, is hopefully going to be the site, if there is a site in the West Midlands we attract a gigafactory to, and we are now investing in the supply chain that will support that future investment. Now that's really, really important. That development alone could attract 10,000 jobs. I can't say I'm going to scrub you out of the map because your jobs aren't going to be in professional services. It would be wrong. But we also have some fantastic businesses that are doing some really high precision engineering in the West Midlands, from complex EV charging technologies to build the blades for rotor blades for wind farms. And interestingly, we went to visit a business in Wolverhampton that builds the activation systems for missiles that are being used in Ukraine, that for about £50,000 a piece, and they make tens of thousands a year, have a useful life once a button's pressed for about 6 seconds. Now, there are enormous jobs and investment coming in, and in at least one of those instances, an overseas investor is going to be investing very soon a lot of money in one of those places. Not only can I not tell people in the West Midlands in those sectors that you're not relevant, I'll be telling a mass of overseas investors that we don't want you anymore here. So that would be wrong. What I'm not saying is that other sectors like services aren't important. And to be honest, like any business, its true value and its resilience is based on being multifaceted, i.e. if you place your bets in something or one thing, you're very vulnerable. Also, look, and I've spent my life in professional service. I know how important it is, but I also know the service industry is the industry that's going to be most subjected to AI as we move forward. There is no doubt about that. And lots of academics and commentators have talked about the opportunities there, but there are enormous vulnerabilities too.
Okay. Why don't you comment on that as well, Esther?
Yeah, no. So I definitely see that point. It's not, and I really think that there are scopes for cooperation and spillovers between manufacturing jobs and services that might be we're underutilizing at the moment. And particularly, it sounds like you have good strategies going on around developing these industrial zones around green technologies, which would sort of combine some of these goals that are laid out in the industrial strategy. What I don't think we need to do is to invest heavily in generating more jobs outside of what would otherwise be competitive, because it sounds like what you are describing is kinds of firms and industries that would be competitive in international markets anyway. So I feel like a better strategy then would be to make these firms able to grow as much as they want, attract foreign investment, make infrastructure function for them in a way that actually makes them grow, and then we can let the market sort out some of these issues. It would be my preferred version of that. I'm not sure.
And in our most recent trade policy paper, we said on goods we should essentially have a defensive strategy, trying to sustain and protect the industries that are already performing well. And on services, you should have an aggressive strategy. That these were the areas where you should go for growth and things like more mutual recognition of qualifications.
Yeah, I think I agree. Back to my point on value, not volume. We've got to be honest. Pick a part of the value chain that we're going to be good at, and we have a feasible size, demographic, skilled pool of labour to be able to sustain that kind of competitive growth, not just growth for growth's sake in some of the sectors. And those are the ones that we go after. Obviously, external challenges will will move these in different directions for a government en masse. So if you take the outcome of COVID or the impact of having specific Asian countries involved in the manufacture of security-specific elements, there are things that happen every few years that will force governments to say we should probably make more of these things ourselves rather than just be overly reliant externally on them. And so those things will push you into territories that will test that hypothesis quite actively. So again, having a long-term strategy is probably quite good so that you don't get buffeted when those things happen.
Yes, and if I can just add on to that, I think one version of being exposed to these shocks would be not to say that we necessarily have to do everything ourselves, but we can also forge closer ties with our trading partners, right? So I feel the trade discussions often focus so much about exporting, but of course a lot of trade policy has to do with firms importing what they need, and having these ties be forged closer, I think would help a lot on
Yes, and another very live topic, which I may not have time for, is what a resilient supply chain looks like, and where you can envisage an autarky, whereas medium-sized economy like ours does have a full resilient supply chain.
David, can I say one more point? Is that interconnectivity between these two parts of the economy is really important. So anyone who works in professional services would be silly to say, oh, we'll just let the manufacturing sector dwindle, because lots of them will be their clients. And so it's very difficult for an economy to sustain itself internally just based on services consumption. And that gets missed quite a lot.
Those great turbine blades you were talking about work so effectively because of incredibly smart sensors that have been designed by our science and technology base, and very smart software. So they move incredibly rapidly to every tiny adjustment in the wind. And that's
and I think it's that connectivity. And we can't, if we drag down a sector line, we miss that connectivity, particularly with supply chains. But there's something else about the skilled workforce. I went to Warwick Manufacturing Group, which is a great technology research centre for manufacturing industry. JLR had their top 20 software engineers there that week. But the most interesting slide I was shown, and those folks are very important to driving improvements in technology and research, but they can only do their jobs if they're surrounded by a group of people with other skills. And actually, and then I went to the Battery Industrialised Centre in Coventry, where they run experiments and some prototype work for businesses investing in battery technology. The rocket scientists were there, but sadly they had to hold up some of their work for 3 days because they can't access the lab technicians that need to set up the experiments. That's how chronic, our skills problems got in this country, that even when we've got the folks at the top end doing their work, they often can't complete it because we've got big holes in the skill system that supports them and surrounds them.
We might come to the skill system in a minute, but first I'm just going to give an opportunity to our physical attendees here. Let's collect a couple of interventions. Yes, gentlemen here, and then I can see several hands going up. Let's collect a group, yes. If you could give your name and organisation, that'd be brilliant.
Okay, my name is Tim Page and I run my own consultancy called Industrial Paradigm, but I worked for 16 years for the TUC, helping to develop their industrial policy. And I turned my TUC research into a PhD thesis a couple of years ago. And I wanted to ask about good work, because it feels like it's the missing part of the jigsaw. When Richard talks about manufacturing in the West Midlands, I mean, there are all kinds of reasons for manufacturing, but manufacturing provided good work for non-graduates. And when Esther was talking about good work in services, the question that comes to my mind is good work for whom? Is that good work for graduates based in London and the South East and a few other pockets? Or is that good work that goes around the regions and provides well-paid jobs for non-graduates? Because that, for me, Germany focuses on good work for non-graduates. China focuses on good work for non-graduates. But it doesn't seem to be a big part of our debate in the UK. So I wondered what the guys thought about that.
Let's try, and I've got a couple of online questions about that. Are any of the people physically here, I want to ask in the work skills area? I think what I'll do then is I will add a couple of online questions. There's this one, for example, which follows on from your theme. It's about meeting skills needs of places and the skills needs of businesses across the UK. And there is a kind of issue there, and you were very strong on the sort of devolved, let's do our skills work. And I have to say the loss of RDAs there was a blow. The US companies used to be able to say, if we want to set up in the UK, I want to be confident there's going to be the 5,000 people we need with the right skills. We could have that conversation with the RDA like you could with the US state. Been very hard for the last decade. to have that conversation with anyone. But do you have any responsibility for skills beyond your own region? So where you think you can take the skills agenda?
Yeah. So I have responsibility for just 10% of the skills budget, and that's post-19. So I'm picking up issues that often young people are a consequence of failures in either the education system or in those young people's experience between 16 and 18. And frankly, the 170 million I've got doesn't go very far. And frankly, the biggest difference I could make with it is if I invested it early in young people's lives. And even if every pound was delivered effectively, there wouldn't be enough. And if there was enough, it would take me 19 or 20 years to work for every cohort of that group until we turn the corner. But like the other mayors, we would like to have a greater say working with industry on shaping the skills system post-16, not just post-18. And it comes back to the fact that there is no way that anyone in Whitehall can second guess or understand, have an insight into the skills issues that need to be addressed on the ground more effectively to not just deliver the jobs that businesses want, but to address the learning challenges we faces and the investment we need to make in young people. That is a matter of fact. If it wasn't an issue, we wouldn't have this demand for 800 welders that can't be met in the West Midlands, which is stopping investment and holding back investment, and we wouldn't be in a position where I come back to those people, young people Tim has talked about, those young people that come from some of the poorest parts of our region and the bits that have deindustrialised and never recovered, large parts of the Black Country, where there's an enormous demand from those young people that leave school with little or no qualifications to go into apprenticeships in construction when we can't meet the demand for those courses because those colleges there cannot retain or recruit the lecturers because those folks can get twice as much now working in industry.
Well, you have got the flexibility from the redesign of the apprenticeship levy, and we have argued here at Resolution, of course, that really should focus on levels 2 and 3 and the under 25s. The amount that's going on degree apprenticeships for over 25s, which could perfectly well be funded out of fees and loans, is a diversion of effort.
Yes.
And perhaps some of that money could go under
Agreed.
your control. Esther, your observations on this?
Yes, so I definitely agree with the apprenticeships sort of framework can be very useful here. To give one example of the kinds of sort of good jobs and services that I have in mind, there's research done on this in the US where, of course, there's been lots of talk about the effects of these tariffs that Trump has put in. So think about solar panels, for instance. If you put a tariff on a solar panel, then of course the idea is that you shift the production to domestic production in the US, and that's going to be good for growth. But in fact, the research is finding that it's a negative effect if you take into the account the fact that most jobs in the solar sort of supply chain is in actual installation and not in production of solar panels. So I think that's one example where it's not entirely obvious that relocating the whole production chain domestically is what's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. And actually maybe one thing you can focus on is getting these good jobs that have to do with installing or deploying the technology on the ground. So I think that's one of the examples that I have in mind. And apprenticeships can of course come in and help with this. If businesses are able to get young people trained in these jobs, I think that would be a useful place to start.
Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a ton of cash in the levy that's not being spent. So reform, we've been asking for that for as long as I've been at the CBI. So the quicker we can get to that conversation, the better. We've got to also be probably quite comfortable with an uncomfortable discussion about skills in an economy that's evolving. It is impossible for us to have the right amount of skills in the right places that is the current economy and the evolving economy at the same time. And so, you know, we've got to be realistic that there are going to be gaps. Now, some of the gaps are too big. But we need to be honest about that. And business business struggles to know what skills it's going to need in 2 years' time because it doesn't know whether or not it's going to be mass adopting AI just yet, because lots of businesses will only do it until they absolutely have to do it. And so there's a very small enlightened band of businesses in the UK that have enough headspace and capital and time to fully be able to plan the skills that they will need in 2, 3 or 5 years' time. Most people are thinking about next week, and I think that is a structural challenge for us.
Also, just a quick point on this. I think with the skills issue, the way I see it is that it is about building capacity and capability and step by step. And if people have got a skill, their adaptability and flexibility and their agility improves immeasurably. It's a lot more difficult to move from level 2 to level 3 to be a rocket scientist. But we can take these things one step at a time. And the sad thing for me is that there hasn't been a focus on Big Bang, but we mustn't approach it in that way. We've got to build some real resilience in our workforce and tackle the skills issue one step at a time.
Right, let's collect some more interventions from here. I'm going to send Greg on a mission to the furthest reaches. There's a question there, and then we'll come over to this side. Yeah.
Alex Mash, and I work for the CMA, but speaking in a personal capacity. Can I ask a question on something Jordan just said, which you said businesses will only implement AI basically as late as they have to. That doesn't sound like a very positive thing for a country that wants to innovate. So why are businesses thinking like that, and what is it that can be done through an industrial strategy to change their mind about that?
Why don't you comment on that now while Greg pads round to the other side? Yeah.
For anything that's being clipped, that's not the official CBI line. I'm saying that there are lots of businesses who basically will only do it at the point at which they have enough capital and resource to do it, which probably won't be today. And so if you think about the AI debate en masse, most parts of public policy, in my experience, the private sector is happy to go first and let the state catch up. In one of the few areas where they really want the state to go first is regulation of AI, because people don't know what they're buying. Yeah. They don't know whether or not it's good for them. They don't know if they're being ripped off. They don't know whether their peers are buying it. And so actually there is a big role for regulators and other people in this space to start setting some quite clear frameworks that this is in the good category. This is a manufactured service product that we can believe in and trust. And therefore we are basically green lighting it to the economy en masse for you to go out and start purchasing. Otherwise, we will continue to be in a space where the people who get the best benefit will be the people who can afford the big four and other people to come in and tell them about the best products. But most businesses won't get there tomorrow. So this is one area where government does need to go first, I think.
Thank you very much. Now, there were some questions around here. Yes, I think there's a batch of 3. Yep.
So Patrick Shine, I work for the Shaftesbury Partnership. And my question is about resilience and the periodicity of the investment cycle. I used to work in the City of London, where the innovation cycle is about 5 years. If you're talking about runways or power stations, you're thinking about generations and decades. And if we run out of power or we run out of ability to channel water and we get floods, that's catastrophic. So there seems to be a particular mindset about the resilience merchants who think very long term. My question is whether we need to take that on board explicitly when we're going for growth.
Thank you, and let's pass that forward. I think there were questions in the front row as well. Yep.
Patrick Newman, there's a lot of flag waving for service industries, no problem, but what about AI? AI could devastate service industries in a relatively short space of time.
Very interesting point. Yep.
Sorry. That's all right. Hi, Jeff Austin. I spent my time as a planner and an economist. I advised government on older housing, Mr. Portillo on competitive activity in government and local government, sadly. Richard. The thought that's occurred to me is the million target on housing. One of the big issues is that the demolition rate of older housing is very low. And we're expecting a whole stock of houses to last a long time. So there's the retrofit side of it, which is obviously a big part of the policy stuff. But there's also the issue of building materials supply to the current industry and the role of the builders in producing any part of the supply of, the equipment, the heating, the electrics, the window frames, the tiles, even the bricks. Most of that comes from Europe, I think. I don't know, you probably know more about that. But I've got a great fear that in reaching for that target, the big issue is that all those jobs in those manufacturing activities and trade activities are passing us by now, because you need a plan for that workforce, and you also need a plan for the supply side.
Right, those are 3 different questions: resilience, AI in services, housing and investment. Esther, nobody should, not our panel should feel obliged to answer all 3, but Esther, your comments first.
So, if I may begin with the AI and services one. So I definitely agree that the landscape is uncertain at this point. I don't think we quite know exactly how AI will come in, what kinds of skills it will replace, and what skills it will enhance. And the way I see it being used for now, I think it has a lot of scope for enhancing skills in the service industry, and you can implement it in a way where it's complementary to your workforce rather than necessarily taking the jobs sort of directly away. I think we've seen a lot of the kinds of services jobs that can be very easily offshored have already moved abroad, and the kinds of services that we're left with now, I think we are not at a point with AI yet where it's good enough to replace those kinds of services jobs. But I think it's definitely very important to keep it in mind as something that will trickle along and potentially disrupt things as we go along.
Right. Thank you. Jordan?
Yeah, I go. So look, there are sectors that will fret about it more than others. So the services industry is really broad. Like, let's not forget, it's not all about auditing. There's creative services, there's business support services, there's recruitment, and so there are elements of kind of human imagination, human to human contact that I think you're right. I don't think we're there yet. Thankfully, the CBI is at no risk just yet of being AI. That being said, if you are in a profession that has a highly technical element to it, which is very process heavy and has a huge entry level element of your workforce, I'd be surprised if they're not fretting about what happens in the next 5 to 10 years, because those are highly repetitive tasks, and they are based on things that are written down by and large. And so if there's not a degree of nuance or fact-finding that has to happen, and it is a repetitive fact-based task, then obviously that will be at risk. I think, again, to my first point, we would be stupid to say that's not at risk. And so if you're in those industries within the professional business services sphere, I'd be worrying a lot more.
Right. Okay. I can't work out if we're supposed to worry about it at Resolution Foundation or not. We'll think about that further. Now, what would you like to comment, particularly on that housing point? Because housing and house building is one of the big challenges in the West Midlands. And do you want to pick up on that?
It is. And when we develop our regional growth plan, as we have to do, we'll be looking at all those factors that we need to drive growth in our economy, because there is a shortage of housing. Across, I think the West Midlands is relatively uncontroversial in terms of the Deputy Prime Minister's requirements. I think we're a largely stable state after pluses and minuses. And we've got our biggest challenge, to be honest, is more strategically is developing on brownfield land that is quite expensive to remedy and decontaminate. But there are, I see this as being a fantastic opportunity. If we invest in the right skills, there are some jobs there for many people in an industry, in a sector that's ageing massively, and that's the other factor we've got. And of course we have got new production techniques. I mean, I've visited some off-site manufacturers, who've got enormous potential to volumise that activity, but we just haven't got elements of the supply chain fitting together. I won't say I'm relaxed about house building. I know that there will be inflationary pressures because of the demand, but look, if we can't get that right, we can't get anything right.
Yeah. In a moment, we're going to go to our polling question, but I just wanted to comment on your observations on housing, because I have to say, when you look at off-site manufacturing, and why that modular building has not taken off in the UK, one of the arguments you hear is we do not have completely standardised planning rules. Different planning authorities look for different features. In fact, Birmingham was seen as one of the best possible lists because you had one of the largest requirements. But standardisation, less planning discretion on exact features of a house would have made modular housing more successful, and legal in general. Richard Wilson is a friend about it, but they pulled out of it because they couldn't make it viable.
If I can just add to that, you hear that about infrastructure projects in general. I think that there's too many decision makers involved and too many differences in regulation that just means that projects never get off the ground.
When Pompidou took France into civil nuclear power, he commissioned and they built over 20 identical design nuclear power stations. Britain says we'll do one and then we'll look at how it works and then we'll change the design.
There's one other factor that's been driving, and Dave's absolutely right about the planning variability, but I've worked, before I got into this, I was helping some off-site manufacturing sort of entrepreneurs. The issue they had, there wasn't one site in the West Midlands they could buy commercially at a level that would allow them to deliver off-site manufacturing on it, i.e. they will get outbid by more traditional house builders and developers. And that was an issue about the density they could build at and the height they could build at, and that held them back. So we also need some interventions at a planning level if we're going to support that industry.
Right. So you felt you hadn't got the discretionary planning power. There was no way that you could intervene and say,
Indeed.
Right. Very interesting point. Let's now go to our polling question, and I'm going to ask our panelists to comment on this. So this is because we all know, and there's an admirable list in the Green Paper of areas where we could do more, but prioritising happens at every level, including governments can't do everything. So here are some options. We're not going to go to the results straight away. What I'm going to do first is go to our panelists as to which of these, if we have completely failed to identify the silver bullets that you know about that we failed to spot, you're allowed to add that. Why don't we start with you, Richard? Which of these would you go for as your single priority? I think I know which one you're going to have. But take us through your argument.
It would be remiss of me, wouldn't it, to not pick on devolution. And I'm a firm believer, and I wouldn't have taken on this role if I didn't believe that the best way we can deploy resources and pull the levers we need to sort of activate our economy is by devolving more decision making across a broad front of activities.
But can I just press you, where do you accept you need national standards? And to what extent do you agree that this devolution is of discretionary spending within national frameworks, of which the house building is one potential example?
So we've got some single settlement coming. It will allow us, gives limited powers to in essence, at the moment, there are hundreds and hundreds of devolved powers we have, but we have to spend that money within constraints and parameters set by government.
Right.
We're going to have more freedoms to deploy resources on housing, on skills, on supporting economic growth, and on transport more flexibly. That will allow us not just to decide what one of those areas merits more investment, but also within those areas what we spend our money on. And I'm in no doubt that in every case we will be spending money in each case 50 to 70% differently, and I think more effectively than if those decisions were made in Whitehall.
Right. Okay. Jordan, your views on that?
So probably go number 3. I don't think I'd write it as science and technology. Probably a mix of tech and industries of the future, but I'd say that because if you do that, you can get the benefits of some of the others. So I think tax as a centrepiece is probably quite difficult to build a whole load of public policy measures around. Rejoin the single market, in the future, some government that isn't this one most likely will look at things like that. And obviously, if you get, skills is so broad. Yeah. So if you double down on the future of the economy, science and technology, you'll get the skills investment. You'll get more comfort to devolve power because we're growing the economy, and you'll get more elevation of tax reform and debate about what the future of the tax system should be to adapt to that. And so I think that is the future. If you're not doing that, I don't know what we're doing. Okay,
that's interesting. Good. I'm pleased we're getting some diverse answers. And Esther, where are you?
Well, I will complete the puzzle and I will say rejoin the single market. I'm a trade economist. So, what do you expect?
You can say that.
I realize it's probably a wasted vote because it's not going to happen. But I feel similarly to what you said, that if you do that, you're going to get lots of these other things come along with it, because you're going to open up for more migration, you're going to open up for more investments, you're going to increase more science and technology. I mean, I think it's a pretty easy win in economic terms, maybe not so much in political terms.
I have to say, when we did an analysis, when the government announced the target of raising our growth rate to the highest performance of the G7, which means America, when we looked at what you could do that would deliver that step change of at least 0.5 percentage points a year, the only thing we thought that rose to that, had that scale effect, was single market and customs union. So it may come back onto the agenda, we never know. Let us see what the reaction now, what our online participants, the online participants have gone something, another one. We've got invest in skills from our online party, and that's very interesting. With rejoin the single market second, and then we've got devolution, then we've got science and innovation, and tax at the bottom of the list. Very interesting set of responses. Any people here in the room who want to comment on their policy priorities? Which of these you would have gone for, or whether you would have gone for something different? I think we can take silence as meaning that I've gone for the single market. That's how we work at Resolution.
Yeah.
But that's how we interpret these things. Right. Let's now have some. We've got just a few minutes to go. Let me now go back to our online party. I think there is a bit of looking at what's being upvoted. There's a little bit about the mechanics. There's this lively debate: is industrial strategy ever stable? What will governments really be able to deliver it? So there's a question here around how we could, especially if these arguments cut against other departments' priorities, how do you get Whitehall as a whole to engage? And then there was another one. Yes, this is a very naughty one. Can the Treasury be trusted with it?
Did someone from DBT write that?
Well, I tell you, this one I think we do know, but I always assume that our anonymous questioners are for the highest level of civil service participants. They come from all around Whitehall. And then there was one other one. Well, why don't we throw in, as devolution is such a hot theme, there was a devolution one. How would you, will that really reduce regional inequalities? This is the tricky problem that if you have low areas and high income areas and you want to transfer money to the low areas, it has to come from the high income areas, and central government gets heavily involved in collecting it and transmitting it, and as soon as government is distributing it, it starts having very strong views how it should be spent. So I think we should take this as a sort of broad set of questions about the governance framework that you need to deliver this. And you, of course, have now in the West Midlands my old friend Greg Clark, now working for the Warwick Manufacturing Group, who wrote an excellent industrial strategy, which I happen to have an example here. He produced a previous one, his of 2017, and that included an industrial strategy council, and he got Andy Haldane to chair it, which was going to keep the policy honest, ensure that it and measure its performance. That was sadly lost and now being recreated. So I think what we'll do in the last few minutes, let's work along this way, start with Jordan, then Esther, and give the last word for the conference, because we're down to our last few minutes, to Richard. But Jordan, your observations about how all this can be governed and deliver.
So I think two things. Number one, so this gentleman's point about long-termism, that means boring. Boring means structures, structures means terms of reference, and all the things that don't make it into an FT article. That's really important. That's why you keep getting new councils every 5 or 6 years. We need one. They've agreed to put it on statutory footing. Claire Barclay's going to head it out from Microsoft. Fantastic. Good job. Big tick in the box. Let's get going. Let's not change it again, even if we get a new government. I think second point about has it got any teeth and can the Treasury be trusted? The difficulty with DBT running it on its own, which is a good reason, which is a good sign that they're not just running it on their own, they're doing it with the Treasury, is that in a kind of non-big spending department where actually lots of your growth levers sit across government, you'll eventually get drowned out when it comes to a budget or a spending review, because all roads lead back to the people with the money. And so that is why I think it's really important that right from the start, DCIT and DBT and the Treasury all came out collectively and said, this is our industrial strategy, it's a government industrial strategy. Even if they then go back on it, you can hold them to account because it's not in isolation, just in the business department. That's a good thing.
Right, very good. So you're saying you are cautiously encouraged about how this is now currently the plans for delivering. You like the return to
I think so.
Industrial Strategy Council, and you like DBT.
It's a single front door as well. You know, if you're a business going,
right,
oh God, I'm really struggling to grow, but I've got to talk to the DWP about this, but I'm actually a transport sector, so I've got to talk to Heidi Alexander now about this. But actually, I think someone DBT controls that lever. You know, the industrial strategy, the council could give you a front door into those discussions. We did it in COVID and it actually worked really well.
Thank you. Esther?
I agree with all of that. No, I think we discussed it a little bit earlier as well, but how do we make sure that the strategy has some long-term bite? I think having some unified entity that delivers this would be extremely helpful. Now, I think this is a very interesting question that we have up here in the slide. From an economic point of view, I think it's very easy to say that you should have a lot of this be centralized, because then you can do exactly this redistribution across regions that is otherwise going to be very hard to do. That being said, I think there is scope for having more decision-making power over exactly how to spend the money that you do get in your local area. So I think we probably need to end up with a bit of both.
Right. Richard, it's very good of you to join us this evening. Your reflections both on this whole governance question, but also more widely.
Well, firstly, I'm very pleased Greg is now in the West Midlands, Warwick Manufacturing Group, and I was with him last week because the Business and Trade Select Committee visited, doing a regional visit, and I was invited to a visit they made to University of Warwick. Look, we need growth, and if the industrial strategy sets a framework for that and the real clarity for purpose, I applaud it. But I come back to something I said when I spoke. For me, it then becomes more about what are the actions and the interventions we need to make to move it from where it is to where we need to get to in 10 years' time. That's the substance of this, is that. And we need to streamline our decision making and be braver as a country. Because if we're truly going to deliver the growth and have the confidence in industrial strategy, it's going to drive the way in which resources from central government are deployed, where that money is focused on, and it's going to have to filter through the skills system, the way in which we invest in our infrastructure, and indeed the types of innovation and research we're generating too. I hope government and the machinery in Whitehall is going to be brave enough to do that and follow it through, because if we don't follow through, it will remain as relevant as Greg's paper that you've got sitting on your lap. And for me, the conversations we've had with the government as mayors has been really positive. They're listening to us, and importantly, they recognise two things. That if we're going to deliver that growth, it's going to have delivered in our regions and our regions outside the southeast. And the best ways to deliver that growth is working with mayors and businesses in those regions to ensure that what we're doing is as relevant as possible, and they just need to allow us to make some decisions more freely based on the best triggers for levers for growth that we can pour. And to date, I don't think that has been the problem. Based on my conversations, the resistance to letting go doesn't come from Westminster, it comes from Whitehall.
Right. Very interesting. Well, what a fine note on which to end. And I think we are ending on a note of some cautious optimism. I think there's a belief that we can all see that the Industrial Strategy Green Paper is to be frank, it's a distillation of lessons learned from previous industrial strategies, and none the worse for that. It doesn't tear everything else. Actually, it's, I think, something that Greg Clark or Vince Cable or Peter Mandelson would recognise as a serious piece of work. Now it's got to be fleshed out. I'm delighted we've been able to cover that today, especially with the West Midlands angle, as I can now reveal my late father did run the apprenticeship training programme for a Midlands engineering firm. We were all Birmingham artisans.
Fantastic.
So in my heart, I'm with you on all that manufacturing agenda.
Thank you.
Thank you to you. Thank you to our panellists. Thank you to people with us physically and online.
Thank you.